this session about racial disparities. I am very excited to be here today and to introduce Natalie Spievack. Natalie is a Master of City Planning candidate at the UC Berkeley. Until recently, she was also a research analyst at the Urban Institute, where her work focused on advancing racial equity from birth through higher education and careers. And in that role, she really helped lead internal efforts to develop the organization's structural racism and racial equity work. She's studying housing and community development at UC Berkeley, as well as working for the Othering and Belonging Institute. The research she'll talk about today is really building on her work at the Urban Institute, and I'm very, very excited to introduce Natalie Spievack. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret, and hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really great to be here with you all today. I hope that you've been enjoying the sessions today, or if this is the first one you're coming to, thank you and welcome. So as Margaret said, my name is Natalie Spievack, and I will be talking today about how we can better talk about racial disparities in a way that helps us more accurately identify problems and moves us toward effective solutions. So Margaret just said a little bit about me, but I'll say a few more words before I dive in. I'm currently a Master's of City Planning student at UC Berkeley, studying housing and community development. And as she mentioned, I was working at the Urban Institute in DC just up until this last summer. And while I was there, in addition to the research I did that focused largely on racial and socioeconomic inequities, I also was very involved in helping lead the organization's structural racism and racial equity work, helping create toolkits, lead speaker series, develop internal mechanisms for improving the work. And that's where a lot of the ideas that I'll be discussing today originate from. I also want to say up front that I am very much still learning what it means to do this work well, and I'm continually trying to improve. But the ideas that I'll be sharing with you today are ones that have been really critical in shaping the way that I approach my work and that I think are incredibly important. And I also want to mention that a lot of what I'll be sharing is the product of collaborative thought between myself and some incredible colleagues at the Urban Institute, many of them colleagues of color, and that the work that we did really was made possible by the decades of work that racial justice advocacy organizations have been doing in setting an example for how to do this work well. So a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. I'll first say a few words about the motivation for this presentation and ground us in some key concepts. And then I'll talk about the ways in which the language we use to describe disparities matters in ways that are broader and deeper than we often realize. And then I'll talk about 3 key strategies for improving the way we talk about disparities, including contextualizing them, shifting focus from individuals to systems, and using a strengths-based approach. Finally, I'll spend the last few minutes talking about what all these principles mean from an organizational perspective, and then leave some time at the end to do some Q&A, which Margaret will help out with. And I also, just last note here, want to say that while the examples I'll be providing throughout today's presentation do focus on housing to make this feel as relatable as possible, the concepts we'll be talking about are much broader than just the housing space. So first, why should we care about this? I think that the answer to that question is a version of the common trope that with power comes responsibility. All of us here as housing professionals play an outsized role in shaping the discourse around housing policy. And as a result, I believe that we have a unique responsibility to use our voices and our platforms to shape the discourse in a way that furthers racial justice. So whatever aspect of housing you work in, whether it's homelessness or eviction or displacement or home ownership, you're likely constantly running into disparities in the work that you do. So, from a practical perspective, disparities show up in our work in a lot of ways. They help us to understand problems and to understand effective solutions. And they also help justify why an intervention is necessary or isn't necessary, both internally within our organizations and also externally to potential partners, to funders, and to the public. But despite the centrality of disparities to our work, we often present them as bare statistics, which risks leaving open the interpretation that these disparities are the result of individual failings rather than systemic ones. Or potentially, we go a step further and give a nod to important terms like systemic racism or structural racism without fully explaining what we mean, and as a result, not going far enough in looking at the root causes of those disparities. So, the crux of what I'll be talking about today is how we can do a better job of that. I also want to note that there has certainly been really important progress over the last 5 or so years, and especially over the last year and a half or so, in recognizing the structural factors that drive disparities. And so I think that provides some encouragement that we can hopefully continue to build upon. So now I'll go over a couple key terms that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, but that will undergird everything we talk about today. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. The key point here is that race is a social construct. In other words, race has no biological basis, so it only has meaning to the extent that society gives it meaning. So, as a result, if structural racism didn't exist, we would expect to observe similar outcomes across racial and ethnic groups when controlling for all relevant variables. And of course, as we know, that's not what we see at all. Instead, we see a consistent pattern of disparities across nearly every domain of life, which means that disparities must be driven primarily by structural factors. So we have a name for those structural barriers, and that's structural racism. I'm sure you're all familiar with this concept. You may have also heard of it referred to interchangeably as systemic racism. Hopefully, by the end of these next couple slides, it'll be clear why I prefer the term structural racism. But I also think that a lot of people use these terms without a common understanding of what they mean. So the definition up on the screen is one that I particularly like. So structural racism is the feature of our social, economic, and political systems in which an array of dynamics, systemic, institutional, cultural, and interpersonal, legitimize and reinforce racial inequity. A couple defining features. One is that structural racism is influenced by both historical and contemporary policies and practices. So, of course, there's a long history of structural racism perpetuated against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in the United States, the legacies of which we're still dealing with today. But there are also current policies and practices that either maintain the status quo or actively work to widen disparities. And it's really important that we pay attention to those two. Second, as I just hinted at, structural racism has an intergenerational quality to it. So, what that means is that disparities tend to compound or reproduce themselves over time. And the racial wealth gap is a prime example of that. This graphic here is by no means meant to be all encompassing, but hopefully it helps visualize the complex interplay of a variety of factors in reinforcing structural racism. So here I have those factors divided into three buckets. One is systems and institutions, the second is society and culture, and the third is individuals. And I know that these bubbles are all the same size, but I do want to just note that I think the interplay of systems and institutions and society and culture play an outsized role here because they shape the context in which individuals live their lives. So I'll just talk through this figure starting in the bottom left. We have a multitude of systems and institutions like the housing system, the education system, the immigration system, our democratic systems that create laws and policies that often institutionalize racism. And as a result, that creates what is often what can be perceived as the natural order of things, because this institutional racism is being created by our government, which is an authoritative force in our society. Our society and culture then take cues from this order and reinforce structural racism in ways that are often invisible and unconscious, but that are just as fundamental to shaping the way that people experience the world. So these are things like dominant narratives, stereotypes, cultural norms, and media portrayals. Individuals then take their cues from society and culture about where they belong in the social hierarchy. And that can manifest itself in things like implicit and explicit biases, feelings of othering and belonging, and perceptions of self-worth. And finally, these factors can influence people's support for policies. So if they're led to be more inclined to support policies that reinforce aspects of systemic and institutional racism, then this cycle continues to repeat itself. So if that was a lot and it seemed complex, that's because it very much is. But the key point that I want to get across here is that structural racism consists of more than just systemic and institutional racism, which is why I personally prefer the term structural racism. I find it to be more all-encompassing. With that grounding, let's move to a discussion of why the way that we talk about disparities matters. I hope what you take away from the next few slides is that language is inextricably tied to outcomes, because it's critical to how we understand and interpret the world. And the reason why we pay less attention to language is that the way it operates is often more invisible and unconscious. So I'll use a little bit of cognitive science and social psychology here to try to make the unconscious conscious. First, I'll go over some of the ways that the language we use to discuss disparities shapes the way that people of color are perceived and treated. First, the first example of this is dominant narratives. So everything we hear all of the language we hear is absorbed into our pre-existing understandings of how the world works, or what George Lakoff, who I have cited here, would call frames. We use these frames to subconsciously and reflexively give meaning to the words that we hear. So in the case of disparities, a really relevant frame here is individualism, because it influences the way that Americans think about pretty much everything. And as a result, when we present disparities without pointing to and providing context for who and what is responsible, people's minds are likely to rely on individual level explanations rather than on thinking about the systemic factors that create those problems in the first place. An example of this is that people might assume that racial disparities in homelessness are the result of a lack of effort on the part of the individual rather than systemic factors related to race and class. The second way that language matters when talking about disparities is that it serves to either confirm or challenge existing stereotypes. So continuing with the previous example about the unhoused person, without context about the systemic factors at work, people might attribute the common stereotype of laziness to the unhoused person. Finally, language affects the biases that people hold about people of color. And this can manifest as either overt racism or as implicit bias, but it shapes the way that people of color are treated by indicating and influencing perceptions of who is worthy of help. And that concept of deservingness is really important because when problems are seen as caused by external factors, the problem is seen as worthy of intervention. But when they're not, the problem is seen as the individual's responsibility to fix. And that in turn is critical because it can influence the political will around supporting and investing in communities of color. So the popular rhetoric used to explain disparities has, of course, shifted a lot over time from explicitly racist genetic and cultural explanations to thinly veiled racist dog whistles during the Reagan and Nixon administrations to direct language about personal responsibility during the Clinton era. And today, while explicit racism certainly does still exist, the kind of language that we're grappling with and that we're up against often represents softer appeals to individual responsibility and stigmatization of people and places that can be harder to recognize. So in these clouds up on the screen are some examples of that kind of language. So for example, personal accountability, you get what you deserve, irresponsible choices. Those are common narratives that implicitly put the onus on individuals for creating change. And then language like the achievement gap, ghettos, and bad neighborhoods are ways of describing problems that have the same effect. And this kind of language is the kind that has captured the imagination of Americans and creates pictures in our heads that we use to form opinions. In addition to affecting the way that people of color are perceived and treated, narratives and stereotypes can also affect the behavior and performance of people of color themselves. This can happen through a few mechanisms, including self-fulfilling prophecy, stereotype threat, and internalized racism. And I think these concepts are easier to understand through an example. So I'll just provide a quick definition of each and then walk us through an example using a common thread throughout. So self-fulfilling prophecy is when an individual's expectations about another person result in the other person acting in ways that confirm the stereotype. So for the sake of this example, let's pretend that an unhoused person is part of a workforce development program that has organized an interview for the individual. So if during the interview, the interviewer makes a comment suggesting that they expect the person to perform poorly, that person might in fact perform poorly because of that expectation. And that's an example of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Second and related is stereotype threat. So this occurs if the interviewee's performance declines, even if the interviewer doesn't make any indication that they expect the interviewee to perform poorly. And instead, the poor performance is simply a result of the fact that that stereotype exists at all. Finally, internalized racism is when people of color internalize stereotypes or beliefs about their own group's inferiority, which can lead them to act in ways that support or collude with racism. So for the sake of explaining this, let's pretend that both the interviewer and the interviewee are Black. And in this case, the interviewer might score the interviewee lower than a similarly performing white person because they have internalized racist stereotypes themselves. I want to pause here just to note that people of color have succeeded and thrived despite these stereotypes throughout history, and that whether these stereotypes prevent people of color from succeeding or whether people are able to succeed despite these negative stereotypes, the important point is that people of color experience this psychological burden in a way that other people do not. Finally, moving away from the psychological to the more practical, the way we talk about disparities is important because identifying effective solutions depends on diagnosing root causes. And if we spend all of our energy talking about solutions to symptoms, we risk blinding ourselves and our audiences to the forces that are causing the problem in the first place. So, for example, if a person hears that Latinx people are more likely than white people to be displaced because of gentrification, it might sound like introducing stronger tenant protections is a sufficient solution. But at the root of these disproportionate effects of displacement are other factors like a constrained housing supply and low wages or declining real wages in lower paying jobs. And without addressing those problems as well, the disproportionate effects of displacement will continue. Okay, with that, I'm going to segue into talking about 3 strategies that we should be using to talk about disparities differently. And what I'll do is briefly go over each strategy and then provide some examples of how to employ these strategies in practice to try to make it feel more concrete. The first of these strategies is to use context whenever we talk about disparities. So first, it's important to go beyond a general reference to structural racism and explain what those structures are and how they operate. When doing this, it's important to be specific about the policies and practices that have driven the racial disparity, ideally as they relate to the disparity under consideration. And beyond just naming those policies, it's important to be specific about how they connect to the disparity. So, for example, you wouldn't just want to say that redlining and racially restrictive covenants helped create the racial homeownership gap, but instead you'd want to explain the mechanisms by which those practices prevented Black families from accumulating wealth and being able to purchase homes, and really connect that to the legacy that we observe today. Here's a chart that shows that Black people with mortgages have considerably lower FICO scores than white people with mortgages. So what I'd like everyone to do is just take about 15-20 seconds to look closely at this chart and think about the questions that I've posed at the top of the slide. And then we'll come back together and talk about them. And I'll grab a sip of water in the meantime. Okay, so I'll put a few thoughts up here on the screen. Maybe they're ones that you thought of, maybe you thought of ones I didn't, but without context, a reader or an observer might take away that this gap exists because of insufficient money management skills on the part of Black people, Or maybe a more discerning reader would think that there might be something wrong with the way, or unfair with the way, that FICO scores are calculated. So, what seemingly logical solutions would those conclusions lead to? So, potentially, an observer might think that financial management classes could help to close this gap, or if the FICO score had been identified as the problem, maybe they would consider ways to change the FICO score formula to make it more fair. And while these solutions may be part of helping to close this gap, what's problematic is that without context, the seemingly logical solutions that we reach don't address the root causes of why this gap exists in the first place. So let's look at what kind of context might ideally accompany this chart. I'll go through the text one sentence at a time and kind of explain what each sentence is trying to do. So the first sentence explicitly calls out the incorrect conclusion. So it says, this disparity does not exist because white people are inherently better at making financial decisions than Black people are. The second sentence explains what the actual root cause is. So it says, rather, it, or the disparity, is the result of racist, historical, and contemporary policies and practices that make it more difficult for Black people to perform well on the criteria that determine the FICO score, such as debt and credit and payment history. The third sentence points to specific historical policies and practices and explain the mechanisms by which they contribute to the disparity today. So it says, for example, redlining, racially restrictive covenants, and other exclusionary real estate practices locked Black people out of opportunities for wealth building that make it easier to weather economic shocks and to avoid taking on debt. And finally, the fourth sentence points to some contemporary and current policies and practices that contribute to the disparity, and then also explain the link. So it says, additionally, Black people are more likely to lack access to credit and to be targeted for predatory loans, which increase the risk of default and a lower credit score. So I've hinted at the individual and systems approaches quite a bit during this presentation. So you might already have an idea in your head of what they mean, but I'll briefly go through this slide and then walk us through an example. So the individual approach pinpoints the behaviors or choices of individuals, families, or communities of color as the source of disparities. And as a result, seemingly logical conclusions or solutions focus on changing individual behavior. A systems approach, on the other hand, emphasizes that people make decisions in contexts, not in a vacuum, and specifically in the context of their relationships with systems, institutions, and organizations that affect their lives. And this is important because it helps shift responsibility for change onto the systemic factors that are responsible for creating the disparity in the first place. And I think the really key point here, and something that's really effective about the systems approach, is that when used well, the point it helps to communicate is that even when a person of color and a white person work equally hard, the person of color faces more barriers to success. Here, I tried to include a more covert example of the individual approach that might resemble something you actually come across reading in your normal life. So if you're reading about racial disparities in receipt of federal housing assistance and come across a sentence like, fostering a stronger work ethic and more personal accountability can help transition people off of federal housing assistance. Hopefully, after everything we've talked about, some alarm bells would start to go off in your head, and you'd realize that this sentence is problematic because it's implying that people of color are more likely to use housing assistance because they aren't as hardworking as white people. So let's go over 3 strategies you might use to explain these disparities in a way that shifts blame from individuals to systems. So first, you could use explicit statements about who or what is responsible for the disparity. So for example, you might say, the disproportionate utilization of federal housing assistance by people of color is not the result of individual failings, but of systemic inequities. And then you would go on to provide context about what some of these structural barriers are. A second strategy is to incorporate statistics that reveal structural barriers to success given equal effort. So to do this, for this particular example, you could use statistics that demonstrate that it's harder for people of color to become self-sufficient because they face additional barriers to finding alternative affordable housing and to finding a well-paying job. So you might provide the evidence I have up here that real estate agents show fewer available homes and apartments to people of color than to equally qualified white buyers. And you could also say that Black job applicants are less likely than white job applicants with equal qualifications to get a callback. Finally, you could tackle a commonly held myth head on and provide evidence to disprove it. So in the case of our example, the underlying myth is that most people on housing assistance could work but don't, which is what the statistic that I have up on the screen helps to disprove. So you could say that of the roughly 4.6 million households receiving HUD rental assistance, roughly 85% had a head or spouse that was elderly or disabled, meaning they weren't able to work, or had at least one adult attached to the labor force. Finally, when talking about disparities, it's important to use a strengths-based approach rather than a deficit-based approach. Deficit approaches focus solely on negative statistics and disparities, and they are needs-driven and problem-focused. And we often adopt deficit approaches inadvertently. I know that this is something that I am guilty of doing. But for example, if you are writing a paper about housing disparities and you focus only on problems the whole time, that would be an example of a deficit approach. So in contrast, a strengths-based approach, you might have also heard this referred to as an asset-based approach or a counter narrative, highlights the successes, strengths, and potential of people of color and highlights opportunities for change. And I think that what can be a bit tricky about implementing a strengths-based approach in practice is that it's important to talk about disparities because they help bring immediacy and urgency to solving problems. So what's important is to balance a discussion of those disparities with a discussion of strengths and opportunities. And additionally, a strengths-based approach considers a more broad range of assets than those that are just economic. So it also considers social, political, and cultural strengths as well. And another benefit of strengths-based approaches is that they build on existing strengths of communities of color rather than trying to start from scratch, which is important because that helps to align solutions with the existing capabilities in communities, and also because it's just a more efficient way to solve problems. And lastly, I think that potentially the most important reason to use a strengths-based approach is that it really humanizes people in a way that deficit approaches do not. So a strengths-based approach really recognizes that people of color are more than just a sum of the challenges that they face. So here are 3 examples of strategies you might use to implement the strengths-based approach in practice. The first is highlighting strengths and contributions. So the example I have here balances a discussion of disparities with in eviction and displacement with an acknowledgement of the contributions that people of color led organizations have made in helping create a more equitable housing system by helping create stronger tenant protections and anti-displacement policies that benefit all. Another strategy is to emphasize how policy change can help close gaps. So, this is really important because it conveys that addressing the disparity is not something that's insurmountable, and as a result, helps build the political will to act. So, for example, if the topic is homelessness, you might emphasize that federal housing assistance is a really successful evidence based solution to decrease homelessness and to ensure that families remain stably housed. Finally, a third approach is to highlight the potential that people of color could realize if systemic barriers were reduced. So, if the topic of discussion was segregation, you might say that if levels of Black white segregation in Chicago were reduced to the national median, per capita incomes for Black people would increase by 12.4%. So we spent a lot of time talking about how we should talk about racial disparities, talking about how to talk, which of course makes sense since it was the title of this presentation. But I recognize that a lot of you are probably thinking about what these principles mean from an organizational perspective. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about that. The obvious one, I think, is that we should be incorporating these strategies into the way we talk and write about our work, whether that's the papers we release, the public statements we make, or even the way that we talk to our coworkers about our work. But there are also lessons for how we conduct our work more broadly. And it's important that these principles make their way into action because while language is incredibly important for all the reasons that I've talked about, it's not enough to actually create change. So, one of the big lessons here is that we need to be cognizant of where our intervention lies along the continuum of root causes to symptoms and to really critically think about how that affects its efficacy. And of course, while we want to be thinking about root causes as much as possible, I recognize that not all of our work is conducive to that. And that's okay because uh, doing work across the entire continuum from root causes to symptoms is incredibly important because the root cause work helps to ensure that these problems don't continue to reproduce themselves. But the more symptoms focused work realizes that people have already been hurt by our systems of racial injustice and helps to provide that immediate relief. But I think it's important to make sure that we don't frame solutions to symptoms as sufficient to address the problem, but rather that we consider how systems need to change in concert with our intervention in order to achieve the desired outcomes. And finally, I want to extend the strengths-based approach that we just talked about to practice. So when we're considering solutions, it's really important to focus on how solutions can build on the existing strengths of communities of color. And this requires acknowledging that people of color are not a homogeneous population and that factors like race, ethnicity, national origin, immigration status, language spoken all create unique strengths, and we really need to be thoughtful about those specific strengths. And finally, when considering solutions, a strengths-based approach means not seeing communities of color as problems that need fixing, but as co-creators in finding solutions. Okay, so that is all I have for the presentation portion of this discussion. So I just want to say thank you so much for attending. And I would love to get in contact with anyone who has thoughts about today's presentation or just wants to connect. So my name and email address are up here on the screen. And with that, I will stop sharing and we can turn to Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Natalie. That was so great. I'm looking at the chat to bring some questions and comments forward. One of the questions was, will the slides be available for us to download? And I believe that's yes, right? We will have them all on our website for everyone to share.
Correct.
Great.
This session has also been recorded and will be available in the Housing Washington video library. So if you know some folks who weren't here today and who would appreciate watching this, you can share with them. They would just need to register for the conference, but it's free. There's a lot of great comments about strength-based approaches, strengths and opportunities being a really important way to speak about this. This is a really good one too from Anna here at the Housing Finance Commission. Would be wonderful to see this presentation converted into a learning module with exercises. I love that idea.
Yeah, that is a great idea. Potentially in the future, we could connect about that.
I'll just encourage people to continue entering questions in the chat if they have some. I guess for me, I'm the communications person at the Housing Finance Commission. And so I kind of was listening for how to put the words and phrases and approaches that you mentioned into the way we communicate with our various audiences. And sometimes we don't have a lot of like a paragraph worth of words to do that in, but it sounds like what you're saying is really, you should always confront head on what the misperception might be. And to say, instead of just expecting people to understand that this disparity is because of a systemic reason, you should explicitly say, this is happening not because of personal factors, but because of systemic factors. Is that right?
Yeah, that is definitely right. And it's especially because so much of the way that we process language is unconscious and reflexive, that it's really important to address those things head on. So, for example, even if you don't think that you hold those biases yourself, since these processes are happening subconsciously, you might still be applying those frames of individualism to the way you think, especially if you're just quickly skimming some language and not thinking as deeply about it. So it's important to, directly confront those misperceptions head on as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. And then the other, as you just mentioned, application is really so much about your organization's internal anti-racism work. It sounds like, this is what Anna mentioned about a training module. This is something that we should be sharing internally to really help people confront some of those biases and messages within our own organizations.
Yeah, so that's what a lot of the work that I did at the Urban Institute focused on, is really providing people with these tools to start to apply these important principles to their own work. And I think that this can be tough because a lot of people have been at it in their jobs in this world for a really long time without necessarily employing these approaches. And this can kind of represent a new way to approach the work. So I think that having conversations like this and easily accessible written resources can be really helpful to start thinking about how to do this work well. But that said, I think that an hour-long conversation and a document that's, just a few pages long is never going to do justice to these incredibly complex topics. And that's where a level of, taking the initiative to read books, to read examples of other people's work that are really leading the way in doing this work well come into play. I know that for me, I have learned so much from, um, digging into some of the leading literature about how to bring an anti-racism lens to work, but also just doing my best to learn about the historical policies and practices and the modern day ones that continue to perpetuate disparities, because that's the way that you're really able to understand and point to those more specific instances um, that help to then move us towards solutions.
So that might be a good parting thought is get specific. Don't be afraid to get specific.
Yes.
I'm checking. Oh, we do have a couple of more questions here. One person, Patrick, asks, can these principles also be applied to talk about people living in poverty in addition to race?
Yes, I certainly think that they can. We see similar types of stigmatizing language about people living in poverty as we do about people of color. And I think that that has been part of the movement towards people first language. So, for example, instead of saying poor people, saying people living in poverty, and also in, I think, the move to starting to also interrogate the root causes of poverty in our country. And I think that that gets us into what a lot of people perceive as uncomfortable territory around the economic structures in our country and how they tend to exploit low income people for the benefit of higher income people. But that is also a space that I am in which I'm encouraged that we're moving in a positive direction. But absolutely, I would actually love to spend some time myself thinking about the translation of what I've talked about today to the context of poverty and low income status.
Thank you. We have a couple of other really good questions here from Joanna. Do you have any specific examples of how things improved at Urban Institute through these changes? Looking for a source of hope.
Yeah, I actually can say that I was given hope by the work that I did as well. So I definitely think that there was a big hunger for a lot of this at the Urban Institute, and that people were really excited about being provided with more tools and resources to better do this work. And I think that where the most concrete changes really came into play were in instituting institutional mechanisms to provide a quality check on the work. So things like a blog review process, where experts on structural racism within the Institute would kind of provide feedback on the work. And it was when I left that we were finishing up our toolkit, so I didn't get a chance to see what implementation looked like in practice. But I think part of it is really trying to create accountability mechanisms for making sure that when resources are created, they're not just, a document that lives on the internet, but are also actively used in practice. And, whether that's through professional development, or whether that's through bringing these principles into meetings and specifically dedicating time to talking about how to integrate these racial equity principles into work. I think those are the things that help actually create results from talking the talk, which is what we're doing right now. Oh, Margaret, I think you're muted right now.
I am. Two more questions, and really good ones. First of all, any suggested readings to develop a good historical list of policies and practices that we can highlight? So I think Tanner means the positive policies and practices that take us in the right direction.
So there are, of course, many. So that's a big question. So specific to the housing space, I'll narrow it there because, there's a whole literature on policies and practices that have perpetuated housing disparities and disparities in the criminal justice system and the healthcare system. And those are often found in different types of literature. But regarding the housing space, one that pops to my mind off the top of my head is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but it's a history of how the government contributed to helping segregate America. And then beyond that, I don't know that other specific books come to the top of my head, but feel free to get in touch, whoever asked that, because I do think that I may have compiled a list at one point or another.
Great. We can follow up with you on that and make them available through the conference. And one last question, this is a really good one from Fred Safstrom. How would you respond to those who believe structural racism in housing is a thing of the past with the advent of fair housing policies?
Great question. So I think there are two pieces of that. One is I think, increasingly large body of literature that is able to clearly draw lines between those historical racist policies and practices and the disparities that we observe today. So one thing that immediately comes to mind is this incredible body of research that's coming out about how historically redlined communities have lower outcomes today across a broad range of different outcomes, like concentrated poverty and homeownership, and even the level of heat in communities. So research is starting to connect redlining to the environmental space as well. But I think that kind of research really helps to prove that we're still living with the legacy of those historical factors. And then additionally, there are the modern day policies and practices that perpetuate these disparities. So again, another top of mind example is racial disparities in home appraisals and how a similar house in a Black neighborhood or in a more heavily Black neighborhood and in a more heavily white neighborhood ends up getting appraised as higher or lower, simply because of the location of the house. And so, I mean, there are numerous examples um, of current policies and practices that are on their face neutral, but that are definitely continuing to drive disparities.
Right. There's more research every day that shows this is a real thing. Nobody's making this up.
Yeah.
Natalie, we need to end, but thank you everybody for your great questions. And Natalie, thank you so much for a really, really great presentation. I know that people will be enjoying it after this and getting a lot out of sharing it with their coworkers and friends.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
The next thing for everyone is our Friend of Housing event at 3:15, and that will be showing the last award of the day, and you have a chance to meet and network with the Friend of Housing awardees, all 5 of them. So don't miss that, and we'll see you there. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.